Hello, good morning, and welcome to this Ifoa webinar on the last day of the COVID fortnight, actuarial innovation in the COVID era. I'm Stuart McDonald, and thank you for joining today to hear my thoughts on the past year. And it was an honor to have been asked to do this keynote presentation by the Ifoa. I'm going to try and reflect and tell a fairly personal story. I think we've all heard the main events, the headline events of the last year, and those will be well summarized in the presidential session to come immediately after this one. So if it's not too self-indulgent, I'm actually gonna reflect a little bit on my personal experiences over the last 12 months. It's certainly been quite therapeutic to try and pull it together and make sense of it. And even if the slides are a bit scrappy and I don't remember everything, and I'm sure I won't manage to credit everybody that's been a huge help along the way, but we'll give it a go, and hopefully we'll pick up any loose threads when we get to the question and answer. So a little bit about me. So as I say, I'm Stuart. I'm married with two young kids. One's an infant and one's at preschool. Got quite a busy day job at Lloyd's Banking Group. There I run the team responsible for demographic risks such as death rates and sickness rates and customer retention. I have a volunteer role on the executive committee of the CMI, that's the Ifoa's continuous mortality investigation, where I serve as the chief risk officer. The slightly odd title of this talk is a reference to the Twitter account I've maintained for about 10 years now. I'm gonna make reference to that a fair bit as we go. Not because it deserves particular prominence, but I found it to be a pretty good gauge of kind of activity levels, intensity levels, and I hope that will come across as we go through it. I've been using Twitter, as I say, for about 10 years. I found it to be a very good source of news and information and occasional laughs. You have to curate who you follow quite closely and carefully, and block what you don't want. I mean, with something that's as tailored and customizable as that, anyone that says they don't find the experience useful probably hasn't optimized who they're following. So that's the flow of information in. I've been pleasantly surprised over the year that I've been able to build a reasonable following. Had around 2,000 people following me at the start of last year, despite the fact I was predominantly tweeting about demographics, particularly life expectancy and its impact on insurance and pensions. Now, Twitter's not all about numbers, far from it. I knew I had a bit of a platform, although the numbers following are reasonably modest, still are reasonably modest. Quite a lot of journalists in there, quite a lot of people, paying close attention to the financial sector. So I don't want to pretend that I didn't have a platform or wasn't aware that I had a bit of a platform. I'd had an incident a couple of years ago, 2 or 3 years ago now, where I found a couple of weeks old report from the government actuaries department talking about the impact of the state pension underfunding and how you might have to increase national insurance to pay for it. And as an example of how things can spiral, I tweeted about that, and it quickly got picked up by the Financial Times and then various broadsheet newspapers, and by the next day it was on the front page of the Daily Mail, only in Scotland, but that's it's enough, I think. And so I was aware that once the ball was rolling, it can, and so I think that's reasonably useful context as we go in. If we can go to the next slide, all my slides from here on are going to have the same basic format. So I hope you're not too offended by the aesthetics. So I'm going to try and cover 1 month per slide, though you'll need to indulge me in March, where things got a little bit crazy, and I didn't want to offend your eyes any further. The right-hand bar is analytics that just get generated automatically from my Twitter page, and that will show the bits that I've picked out are the tweet that generated the most noise that month, and the new follower that started following that month that the algorithms deemed to be the most influential, I think, based on their own follower count. So you can see here, there was a tweet I sent that reached about 7,000 people off the back of the Marmot report. You know, you can see that this FT journalist in China with about 40,000 followers started following me. I'm also showing the this table, so just to explain what everything is on these tables, because I'm not going to talk about these on every slide. I'm hoping I can just explain them to you now, and then they'll just be there while I prattle on about the kind of events. So daily mentions, that's kind of how many people kind of tagged me, replied to me, talked about me, etc. Daily tweets, that's how many I actually sent. So I was on about 4 a day, usually, you know, 1 or 2 before work, maybe 1 at lunchtime, maybe 1 in the evening. Tweets seen by about 84,300 people that month, 36 new followers, which increased things by about 2%. And then the next line is the number of bulletins sent out by the Actuary's response group. So just a different kind of measure of activity. At the bottom of the slide, where that stopwatch is currently, I'm going to be showing a chart of hospital admissions in England. So as well as seeing my kind of social media activity as a proxy for my general activity, you'll also be able to see you know, what was going on with coronavirus, and pretty obviously they're correlated, right? And then the pictures and any quotes are just really for my memory, I think, as much as anything, but just to pick out a few events from that month. Obviously can't cover everything by any stretch, just to give an idea of what was happening. So here there's a picture of Edinburgh Castle representing my last team meeting that we held in Edinburgh. So that's the last time I travelled on business. So half my team's in Edinburgh, and I was often up there you know, most weeks, or at least 2 weeks out of 5. I also attended in February this Health of the Nation report, slightly ironically now. So COVID was obviously a hot topic at that. We had Matt Hancock there with us, but you know, we were all, you know, supposed health experts congregated together in a big university lecture theatre, you know, listening to Hancock and various other others talking about the strategy for you know, healthier, longer lives. But obviously the hot topic that had caught up with everybody was coronavirus. But a couple of hundred of us indoors, no face masks, talking about health. Where was the general state of knowledge? So you can see here a headline from January. So it was out there. You know, we were talking about it in the UK. My team at Lloyds Banking Group, I'm enormously proud of, had identified COVID in January, put it onto our risk register, and you know, by February I was getting daily briefings from the epidemiologist that leads our medical research on the global situation and the latest research. We held our first Lloyds Banking Group business briefing on the 2nd of February to start talking about you know, hypothetical impacts and you know, what might be happening with traveling and so on. Public health people were starting to speak out. You know, they obviously started in January, but they were starting to have a bit more of a platform. But you know, I have huge respect for public health colleagues, and they've done an incredible job throughout this pandemic. But to some extent, particularly back then, public health people talking about health issues is kind of what they do, and people to some extent will just block it out. You know, they're talking about this virus this week, they're talking about cancer next week, talking about obesity the next week, and it felt important to me that others start to speak out. And you know, I was feeling like there was a real sense of complacency in the general public. And you know, I remember waiting for our industry and particularly the actuarial profession to start to say something publicly, to use their platform and influence, and really being quite frustrated. You know, those you have the highest expectations of are the ones that come first to your mind when you're thinking about who should be saying something. But you know, I've got to say, I mean, although I retweeted various bits of info that I knew to be credible in February, I wasn't especially vocal in public myself. So that's February. That's our baseline. It's not an ideal baseline because actually it was a reasonably busy month for me. You know, that Health of the Nation thing played right into a lot of the stuff that my follower base at the time were interested in. So, you know, hence getting tagged about 10 times a day. That's reasonably unusual. But anyway, there's the baseline. That's kind of what a normal-ish month looked like. So if we could turn to the next slide, I'm just going to cover the first half of March. Just to give a couple of events, we finished, my team in-house at Lloyd's finished building our first model of the epidemic. So we based this on a sort of standard epidemiologist's susceptible, infected, removed model. We predicted just over our central scenario. We had 3 scenarios, depending on the extent to which the curve was flattened and so on. 260,000 deaths, peaking in July. You can see that model in the bottom left. The chart on the bottom right is showing you the hospital admissions, as I said, and that's darker blue line is March. So that's, you know, that's the whole of March. So that's what was happening. My team got linked into Lloyd's Banking Group's COVID incident teams, business continuity. That's the Dilbert cartoon. We were briefing the finance director at this point, and people realized that you know, my team had a lot to offer in terms of practicalities. You know, what does this mean, not just for how many insurance claims we can expect or how many annuities we can expect to stop paying, but what does it mean for our colleagues' sickness rates? What does it mean for the demand on our various call centers? You know, how are we going to cope with all of those? So I was just impressed actually with how well the organization was able to identify the expertise it has and make the right links through the right project. So in the first week, having built this in-house model, we created a public domain version. You know, with the questions about intellectual property, but I built in about an hour a public domain version that could run alongside. That was basically based off a Stenone paper that was in the public domain. And I sent out a tweet, not the one in the top right, but its precursor, an odds email. So basically, you know, it looked like the one on the right. So these are your odds of getting COVID-19. And the point I was trying to make was that, and you know, unless we introduced some measures, which we hadn't done at the time, to try and limit social contact, to try and restrict the spread of the virus, like cancelling events, that what we would see, as what I expected at the time, was a very slow, gradual increase in the number of cases, and then the number of admissions and the number of deaths over the coming months. And that was really the point I was trying to make. There's no confidence intervals in this one, but you know, it was covered in subsequent tweets in the thread. You know, this thing will build slowly, but inexorably, and become a big problem. That reached 35,000 people, which was quite big for me, including, unbeknownst to me, the president-elect of the Ifoa, Mr. Chieh. And then he made contact at it was 7 p.m. my time at the end of the first week of March, 2 a.m. in Singapore. With quite a brief LinkedIn message. So I had been waiting for, you know, the important actuaries and the profession to say something. If I'm honest, I kind of had run out of patience, and I just thought, if no one else is saying anything, I'm gonna. And then of course he got in touch, and I thought, God, okay, this is it. I'm in trouble now. They've gone right to the president-elect. So anyway, we made contact, and it was, as I said, it was Friday night, 2 a.m. that he got in touch. We had our first call on the Sunday, and actually I wasn't in trouble. I was pleased to hear, but you know, we talked, we shared views, we shared our information sources that we've been relying on. He knew more about some parts of the world than I did, and vice versa. And we talked about what we ought to do, and you know, what we could do, and the reality that large organizations were faced with, dealing with their internal issues, as well as thinking about what to say to the outside world. And it felt like we were going to need to mobilize the right people, and just, you know, really firstly check that others were in the same place, that there wasn't a huge divergence in views, with, you know, people thinking actually you're worrying about nothing. So there were talks about logistics and coordination and so on, but I just thought, look, I think I know most of the experts in this field. Why don't I just send an email to a selection of people that probably know more than I do on the Sunday afternoon? So I kind of thought about who to include, and I thought about where they work. You know, no point bringing in 5 people from one consultancy or 3 from one reinsurer. So kind of picked about 10 people with a view to, you know, 1 person from this consultancy, 1 person from this reinsurer, 1 person from this insurer, and went for the people I know, which tends to be the sort of the leads, or the, you know, the partner that lead on mortality or morbidity, or the heads of longevity, and those sorts of roles. So busy people in the main, particularly at the start of a pandemic. I guess my first signal that myself and Mr. Tam weren't isolated on this was the responses that Sunday afternoon, which was really heartening. Diaries were cleared. I mean, I basically said to people that we're getting together early this week. Please come, or see if, or send a delegate if you kind of agree this is important. And you know, I put out a couple of options, and pretty much everybody came back and said, well, whenever it is, I'm coming. You know, so this obviously was seen as a top priority by the people I reached out to, which gave me some comfort I'd reached out to the right people. On the Tuesday of the second week, we held the first meeting of the Actuaries Response Group, and really things started to get into motion. So what was happening away from the ARG? I put out a tweet on Twitter about how to do susceptible infected removed type modeling, which got quite a lot of visibility and helped people, I think, understand the sort of exponential early phase of the curve. We were starting to see real kind of business impacts now within my organization. So I can't say much, but you know, there was a project going on with external counterparties that would have had quite a high dependency on mortality rates, and you know, it was agreed that it wasn't a sensible time, so that we were out of that. We moved to working from home, so my last day in the office was towards the end of the second week of March. I grabbed my last beer in a pub in that week, and I think I caught COVID, whether it was in the pub or whether it was traveling to and from. But you know, a few days later, I was wiped out, which may or may not just have been kind of adrenaline and running 100 miles an hour. But with hindsight, I think probably, you know, probably was COVID, particularly if the guy I met for a beer with did test positive soon after. We updated our model outputs. The evidence was suggesting an earlier peak. Things were moving quicker. R was higher than we had feared. It looked like there were going to be more deaths. Towards the end of the month, I sent out this tweet on the top right, which was just an update to the odds, and it was reflecting those changes in our model, that, you know, more deaths, earlier peak. I wasn't talking about deaths publicly. I didn't want to be scaremongering, but I was just talking about the odds of getting it, and you know, people could look elsewhere and see what the fatality rates were. That one got picked up by Ben Goldacre, the bad science guy, who's you know, very well known on social media and has done incredible things through this pandemic, leading the Open Safely project, but that's another talk. picked up a very influential follower, Alan de Botton, the philosopher, with nearly 900,000 followers himself. So, you know, with people like this starting to share my work and thoughts, you can see the kind of step change in metrics. You know, over 2 million people seeing the things I was saying in public that month. Number of followers more than doubled, went up by 150%. We wrote our first 5 ARG bulletins in March, so not all of them in the first half of March. But let's turn to the next slide, please. Second half of March. So we had meetings again of the ARG. Again, we updated the model outputs. Lockdown, right? I mean, that hit all of us hard. So obviously we had the various stages on the way in the week leading up, but then on the 23rd of March, we had that order, you know, which I'm sure all of us will remember for the rest of our lives, to stay at home. We started to see misinformation spreading more publicly, and with the team that I'd pulled together, we started to combat this, and you know, parceling up stories depending on who had availability, who had the kind of expertise, getting sort of do a checker peer reviewer type processes in. So one of the ones that I debunked on Twitter and in my first ARG bulletin was this paper from Sunita Gupta's team at Oxford that actually more than half of the UK population might have already had coronavirus, so it's nothing to worry about. And I showed how that was implausible if you looked at the data from Lombardy in Italy. I started to report weekly on the ONS weekly death statistics. So I hadn't done that since 2018 when we'd had a bad flu, and I was kind of drawing attention to that. So I restarted after a 2-year break. There weren't actually any excess deaths at the time I did it, but I wanted to introduce that language to people and help them understand that the way to measure the pandemic's impact was going to be excess deaths rather than official COVID deaths, which was the thing that was finding its way into the mainstream. There was an ICL engineers study as well that we debunked. I did something on Twitter. Matt Fletcher did a great bulletin on the same topic. You know, just seems ridiculous now, but they were claiming that there would only be 7,000 deaths, and we were showing why that was a somewhat ridiculous claim. Let's move on to April on the next slide. This is where things really went a bit crazy. So you can see in the top right the unpleasant and inaccurate narrative tweet, the tweet. This one kind of exploded. Dan Ryan had sent me this IGNAT report, and well, he shared it with the group, and it was just marvelous. It was a real deep dive into the the statistics of what was going on in intensive care, the early indications of survival rates, the who was being admitted, what their background characteristics were, far more detailed than the general hospital statistics that were available. And we'd already planned a bulletin about comorbidities, but this just felt like it was powerful enough in its own right. So I banged something out in about 20 minutes without much thought, really, on Sunday night, having read that report. And it got pick up. Over the next few days, because it was a Sunday night thing, people were retweeting it, people were commenting on it, people were talking about it. And it just kind of rumbled on. Normally Twitter's kind of all the action happens in a few hours, but this one, it just seemed to keep getting picked up, particularly by various medical people who I guess maybe work shifts and aren't, they're not doing the 9 to 5, and it just kind of seemed to have legs. So kind of every time I looked at my phone, there'd be a load of new notifications, even after a few days. And I was very, it's a really busy period, and we were leading up to the Easter holidays, and I promised my family some time away from the desk. It had been kind of 6 weeks working 7 days a week by this point. And Easter, we had a beautiful sunny day, and I was out in the garden with the kids. I put my phone down for about 20 minutes to put up a gazebo, and I picked it up again, and I had 260 notifications in the last 20 minutes. And it turned out Andrew Neil had retweeted it to 1 million people, which kind of exploded everything. Within an hour or so, Fraser Nelson got in touch asking if they could reproduce it in The Spectator. Owen Jones, who's at the opposite end of the political spectrum from Andrew Neil, also retweeted it to 1 million people. And you know, by this point, various Labour and Conservative MPs were talking about it, were retweeting it. It was getting a lot of visibility. I mean, you can see there, it was about 720,000 people that engaged or that saw it that month. And in total, you know, my activity got visibility with about 4 million people. Number of new followers leapt again. I was getting mentioned by about 120 people a day. So you can kind of imagine the constant stream of notifications coming in, and feeling like, I mean, I was still trying to manage my account in the same way I had before. If somebody says, "Hey, Stuart, what's your view on this?" You know, and asked me a question, I was trying to answer. So it's pretty intense. I got contacted by the Intensive Care Society, and they were really pleased by this report of the data showing that what their members were going through, and you know, what's the reward for good work? They asked me if I could keep doing it. So that was the next addition to. I'd already resolved to start doing ONS deaths once a week, but you know, could I then do this Intensive Care Society report weekly? I got interviewed by the Wall Street Journal. We did a report over in the States about again, excess deaths, why excess deaths is the way to understand the pandemic. I got my first request to do TV. There was a Channel 4 Dispatches show. We decided against that one. I spoke to my employer. It was about kind of who knew what when, and it did feel like it was going to be quite critical of the government response, and perhaps some, you know, risk. Even if I wasn't very negative, others would be, and you know, I didn't want to put my employer in a difficult position. The CMI came into the game this week, so they've been absolutely excellent through this pandemic. They started putting out weekly mortality monitors, so the excellent report that they do once a quarter started to do once a week. And we also had an incredible volunteer effort this month. So both the ARG and the Ifoa, you know, put out calls for its members to get involved, to do what they could to help, and the response was astonishing. And quite humbling. If we could move to the next slide and talk about May, this is a quieter month in some senses, falling into the rhythms of these regular meetings. So you can see there one of our early Actuaries Response Group meetings. We had fairly regular outputs that we're putting out once a week now, things coming from the Office for National Statistics, the CMI, Public Health England, the Intensive Care Research Office, IGNARC, doing our own bulletins. You know, we felt that there was a real thirst out there for just putting some of these reports into plain English and explaining them in, you know, either in bulletins, on social media. I had a lockdown birthday, like many of us, last year. I started to model a second wave and get a sense of what things might look like later in the year or in winter. And you can see the different scenarios there in the top graph for how bad it might be and when it might come. This was early modeling, but we were, you know, it was clear that this was a very meaningful risk. Matthew Edwards and I had an article in the Actuary on comorbidities. We did a piece on infection fatality rates, particularly highlighting very different estimates that had come out of Stanford. So one particularly partisan writer who'd taken a position quite early and has stuck to it, sadly, through the pandemic. You can see the next IGNARC report was popular. The Financial Times started to pay attention. I've called out John Byrne Murdoch there in the bottom right, because he said something very nice that month. He was listing basically how he became very informed, and did a tweet about how the really important thing is to follow lots of experts, where he listed various epidemiologists and virologists and people with different expertise, and included me in that, which was lovely. The FT also came into the excess deaths game. You know, we caught their attention. And we were moving the dial on discussion, and still it's the COVID deaths, Public Health England deaths within 28 days that gets most of the mainstream headlines. But the informed section of the press was starting to pay more attention to excess deaths, and in particular thinking about how we calculate these, what suitable baselines were, and the work of the CMI. And the ONS's excellent weekly report were getting some attention. So let's move on to June. Again, another quieter month. Schools went back. I have to pay tribute to my wife for managing the vast majority of the homeschooling. But yeah, trying to homeschool a young child while you've got a preschooler demanding attention is not easy. It was Zoom month, so the various requests had come in through kind of April and May, and I think that was I did a lot of very similar talks for the International Actuarial Association, the International Longevity Center, a US life settlements conference. Just really talking about some of the early work that I and the response group had done. I did a bulletin about how to calculate R from publicly available data. I did my first interview with Radio 4. So again, this was building on the IGNART thread. That was really what they wanted us to talk about, and the bulletin, and that was fantastic. Just a real highlight of quite a dark time. Doing the report, I was terribly nervous about the interview. I am and as you'll no doubt be seeing right now. But having a wonderful editor makes a real difference. They can chop it down. This was the start of the genre of compliments that I've come to call "My aunt thought you were great on the radio." So I had about 30 or so former colleagues get in touch with me over the next 48 hours. People I probably wouldn't have heard from very often, that might, like your work anniversary on LinkedIn or whatever, but very large numbers of them got in touch, mostly to tell me that their aunt or wife or mother-in-law had heard me on the radio and thought I was good. Always a slightly older female relative or friend. So maybe that says something about more or less's audience, but very nice to hear nonetheless. If we move to July, you can see from the charts at the bottom here, COVID numbers are down, and as I say, interest in what we're doing generally is lower, but you also see there's still a fair bit of activity. Tweets seen by 1.7 million people, still picking up new followers. There was a lot of fuss in the press in July about Public Health England overcounting deaths. So you'll remember any death that happened after a positive test was being recorded as a COVID death, and that was fine early on in the pandemic. But it becomes an increasing problem as as time goes on. So we showed with, I think this is quite a powerful chart, that yes, Public Health England had been overcounting the deaths if you compare them to the Office for National Statistics, who show deaths on, as with COVID listed on the death certificate, but that undercount was a fraction, that overcount was a really small fraction of the huge undercount that had happened at the peak of the first wave. I also, and there'd been talks going on about this in the background through kind of May or June, I attended my first SAGE meeting. I should be honest, I attended my only SAGE meeting today, other than a few, I'll explain. later. So the first kind of one where I kind of attended just to discuss a report. It was a very interesting experience, not one I've particularly talked about at the time, certainly not something I've put onto Twitter. I just did not want that additional heat. I'd find it quite hard, the attention over April, May and June, and I just didn't want to take that to the next level. I was really clear on this. I think that's maybe my summary of the last year. Is I probably spent 2 or 3 weeks wanting attention to draw attention to this stuff, and then a year trying to get the genie back in the bottle. So yeah, I attended Sage. I got sent a 188-page technical document that had been written by the ONS, the Department for Health and Social Care, and the Government Actuaries Department about 12 hours before the meeting. So kind of stayed up all night reading that report and read the exec summary a couple of times over. I thought it was an excellent report, but clearly written by multiple authors, and that was coming across with some of the stuff like the slightly spurious numbers. It kind of reminded me of an old actuarial joke. How many cows are there in those 2 fields? Well, it's 1,002, because there's 1,000 in this field roughly, and there's 2 in that one. We had that kind of thing. Roughly 300,000 deaths from this, and then 20 from that. But the individual bits were well constructed. I had no idea how much detail I would be asked to give at that meeting, and in fact, as it turned out, I could have got away with saying nothing. But I did make 2. I went in with 12 comments, but it was clear by the pace at which Patrick Vallance was moving the meeting along that the authors were there to talk in detail, and then there's kind of a core number of Sage participants that go to all the meetings, and really everyone else is there to brief them. So they had the chance to comment. I did chip in. I'm not sure if that was good etiquette or bad. I had a list of 12 points I wanted to make. I only made 2, I believe, in the end. One, that the estimate for the impact if hospitals became overwhelmed looked very high. I think they said 1.5 million, and it just didn't feel right. And I had some ideas about why. Secondly, that the winter wave they were modelling was going to be very similar to the first one, and I felt that was wrong. I thought we might get a similar number of COVID deaths, but they weren't allowing for the seasonality of the baseline. The fact that you normally get large numbers of flu deaths, and I felt that was probably overstated by about 20,000 or so. So I gave those bits of feedback. Really pleased that actually both of those have been backed up either by subsequent events or subsequent work. It meant I didn't join the meeting until my paper was being presented, but I did stick around afterwards because it was so close to the end of the meeting. So ordinarily the flow of information is one way. But yeah, I did hear a couple of things that weren't in the public domain at the time, but are now. But not exactly national secrets. So I got to hear that there was a pet cat that had COVID 4 days before it broke in the mainstream media. So I kept that secret firmly for those 4 days. Let's move to August, and back on more or less a lovely worded listener question, not my phrasing. What if we weren't a nation of fatties? So this theory that maybe the reason we've been hit particularly hard was because of obesity levels. So I managed to show that wasn't the case. I had a few days off in August. So I took 5 days, including a weekend. I don't think I'd worked every day since February, but I think maybe there may have been one Sunday I'd skipped prior to that. So I was burnt out and really needed that break. Got to see some old friends, took the kids camping. Twitter activity calmed right down, and so it was the calm before the storm. It was a good month. Let's move to September. I always focus on. I'm going to focus on the hard months. I did a briefing on whether we were at the start of a second wave. Was able to use actuarial techniques, incurred but not reported deaths, to give an indication of how deaths were increasing when that wasn't visible to people that were using a straight interpretation. We modeled the hospital admissions as well. You can see a chart of hospital admissions on the top right, as well as the main one. I had another SAGE meeting, but this was a briefing. You know, how we as experts could deal with any ongoing public inquiry that might be coming. So we started doing this chart on the top right, this regular hospital admissions, because we felt we were certainly at the start of a first wave, a second wave, and wanted to show that and make sure people were aware. I had another more or less interview about the same topic. We also got followed and retweeted by Piers Morgan. It says there he's got 8 million followers now. He had 15 million at the time, so I think maybe half of them must have been bots or whatever. That wasn't a great day, I've got to say. I'm grateful. I don't think he and I align on much, but I think he's had a good pandemic. Yeah, that certainly brought me to attention of a very different crowd to the one I'm used to. Project Auxilium began. This is an Ifoa initiative to see if there was more we could do for the public interest. So, you know, you can tell that's the SAGE meeting that I'd attended in July. You know, the feedback was taken on board, and that paper did get iterated, but we were there to endorse a paper. I wasn't involved in the production, the thinking. You know, that had been done, and it was just, you know, have you got any comments that might affect the next version a few months hence? I felt, others felt that we could offer more. And so I met with John Aston and Ian Diamond, along with Colin Dukowitz and Chieh. And we made it clear that we had a lot of resources and that there would be ways we could help. And they linked us into a team that across the ONS, the Department of Health and Social Care, and the Government Actuaries Department. And we worked together on subsequent versions of the document that I'd first reviewed in July. So now I might not have been attending a SAGE to see the work presented, but I was creating the work, or involved supporting the team that were creating the work. Let's move to October, another quieter month. We had these regular Ifoa meetings supporting the government teams, and did a podcast. So my first podcast on Longevity Week, just about, you know, the impact of COVID on short and longer term life expectancy. Let's move to the next slide. This is quite a month. I'm conscious of time. November was another month of panels and presentations. So I did a couple of university lectures, conference in the States, and so on. The attention within the work that we were doing to support government was now on hospital capacity. You know, what does this second wave mean? What happens if hospital capacity gets breached? Did a really fulfilling piece of work that turned into my first academic paper, working with a great team across the Ifoa. We had doctors. We had support from a clinical care consultant. We had epidemiologists, another actuary. So, you know, really good team on that. And we did this modelling, which the Department of Health and Social Care found really useful. So essentially, if you plug in scenarios to the model that we created, so they would look to other groups that were modelling R to create those scenarios, plug those in, and we would tell you what does that do to hospital capacity, and ultimately how does that affect mortality. And we've seen, sadly, that death rates in hospitals really did shoot up in November, December, January. So, you know, was hospital capacity actually overwhelmed? I mean, the truth is, it's not binary. The doctors and nurses and others just keep adjusting, adapting to do the very best they can. But, you know, when the ratios change, the mortality gets worse. Let's move on to December. So I did some work on the vaccine priority order. So this came out of a request from More or Less. They've got a really excellent team there, and they ask the right questions, and they have a way of coming up with interesting questions for people to answer. So I wasn't influential in determining the JCVI's vaccine priority order, but I was asked to evaluate, the logic behind it, and based on what we knew about vaccines, that they were reducing individual risk. We didn't know at the time that they would be helping transmission, though obviously we all suspected that we would. So I did a bit of work for More or Less on that, and I think they just sometimes you just get lucky in the way you present statistics. So we worked out that 88% of the deaths that had happened in the first wave were in the first 4 priority groups. 99% were in the 9 priority groups that had been arrived on. So that got discussed on More or Less. It also got discussed on How to Vaccinate the World, which was a new podcast that Radio 4 brought in that ran through the second wave. And we also calculated essentially a proxy, the number of vaccination, how many jabs in arms does it take to prevent 1 death? And we showed that goes from a really small number, like 20 for the most at-risk groups, up to kind of tens of thousands as you move down to people in their 50s that don't have other conditions. That paper found its way, so we turned it into a bulletin after drafting up the script for More or Less, and that bulletin, which we'd done quite impromptu, found its way into a SAGE meeting, found its way to the desk of senior politicians, and pretty soon Matt Hancock was quoting the 88% and the 99%, and very soon thereafter we heard Boris quoting it. And you can see there an email I got from one of the colleagues I was working at the Department for Health and Social Care, telling me, Boris is confirmed, Boris is quoting your numbers, and we've been furiously reproducing them over the past days. They did reproduce them, the key ones. That was breathed a big sigh of relief there. I also did another piece on how to vaccinate the world. So I was worried at this point about, what we saw with the blood clot story in the end. We were vaccinating people who were near death, care home residents, people in their 90s. A lot of them are going to die. And that's not caused by the vaccine. That's just because, most people that die are of those ages. And so I was talking about that effect, and trying to nip that problem in the bud before it came to light. So we also had our Actuary's Response Group Christmas party, a couple of glasses of wine, a slightly less formal meeting that evening. Let's move to January. So January, obviously, the people started to feel reflective. How did 2020 go? I had the pleasure of doing a really great piece of work with Ed Conway, a retrospective on 2020 mortality. Brilliant. Really interested in kind of walking through from the most superficial, how many deaths have there been, to adding on the layers of complexity that actuaries understand. How do you adjust that for the size of the population? How do you adjust it for the aging population? And what difference do these make? How do you allow for mortality improvements? And he did a really great piece on Sky TV and on Twitter and on their website that walked through all of that. Back on More or Less, talking about a paper that John Roberts had put together. What will be the so he built on the work that we'd done about what the impact on death rates would be, to say actually what will the impact on hospitals be? How will hospital admissions fall? And it's slower than deaths. And then how will ICU admissions fall? Will they fall last of all? This stuff got all over mainstream news. I think January is probably our busiest month for mainstream news, and we ended up using the media manager at the Ifoa, because we were getting kind of 10 notifications a day that we were in one broadsheet or another. I think we were in the Telegraph 3 times one day in different articles. So the ALG was being very widely cited. I did a piece with Tortoise Media, talking about longer term health impacts, and the work on with the Department for Health and Social Care and others was continuing. We started to look at long COVID and other questions. Let's move on to February, which is where I'm going to end the year. So first February was the baseline, March through to February 2021. So things were calming down now for me personally. Still a lot of interest in the ARG materials. I built the ARG's own Twitter following to a point where it caught me up, and just gradually trying to push things away from me and towards that. And I'll talk a bit maybe in the Q&A about how we use those brands differently. Still a lot of interest in what the ARG was doing. This mention from Chris Whitty was actually in March, not February, but forgive me, I'm putting it in because he made reference back to that paper we'd done in December at one of the press briefings. And we were delighted, the Actuaries Response Group, after the huge efforts that team has put in to win that Insurance CRM award in February. So that was really great. So a couple of learnings, and then we'll open up to Q&A. You can use the Q&A box to ask any questions. You can raise your hand if you want to ask a question verbally. I'll just give quick thought. So, from a personal capacity, you need good support around you. I'm really grateful to friends, family, my team at Lloyds Banking Group, the Actuaries Response Group, my team on Project Exilium. For this has been a huge team effort, and I've had some of the focus, maybe a disproportionate share of that attention, and that has pros and cons. I kind of became a bit of a lightning rod for media, and that's kind of interesting. You can't be on learning mode and broadcast mode at the same time. When I set this thing up, I was expecting to spend lots of time reading papers and actually learning about COVID. And my wife tells me I'm not even the most knowledgeable actuary about COVID in our house. I haven't watched the TV, and there were months where I wouldn't get to watch what was going on the television. Months when I wouldn't be able to read any briefings. When you're talking about the bit of work that you did last week, you can't be working on the new stuff, and so we had to kind of divide and conquer. The others on the response group are the ones that have been really doing the legwork and really developing the understanding, and I'm just like the front man that spouts on about it. You need breaks and times away. No matter how fulfilling you find the work, it will break you if you work 60, 70, 80 straight days, and most of those days are more than 12 hours. Learn to say no a lot. Kind of find a technique that works for you. I've never found it easy. I've now got a no phrase thing that I just copy paste, and I do them in batches. I might sit down on a Saturday morning and just send 20 no emails for presentations and stuff. Presentation, no one wants the presentation you did yesterday. Everyone, can you come and talk about our thing? Well, what about this other thing that I'm doing between now and then? Why don't you dial into that? Why don't you listen to the one that I did yesterday that's on YouTube? It's I don't know. It's the way things are, I suppose. The media are insatiable, but some of the individuals I've dealt with have been great, and they've actually built relationships with them. My WhatsApp is very different from what it was some time ago in terms of people that I'm dealing with and chatting to fairly regularly. Those relationships and trust are really important. The media work at breakneck speed, and they need trust. They need social capital. Some of that comes about by looking at who else in the media trusts so and so. So that can lead to kind of herding. If everybody's going to this person, then they're okay. But also, you can build your own individual relationships. Some of the people that have been great promoters of my work and our work, John Byrne Murdoch, Ed Conway, Tim Harford, various others that I should mention. Those relationships were built over time, often supporting them in the background for a long time before anything was said publicly, answering questions. They would come to us saying, hey, so-and-so is saying this, does that seem right? Does that seem believable? With the media, with what you're saying, you don't need to show your workings. It's really something I think we need to reinforce with actuaries. They need to know that they're there, but they don't really want you to talk about them in great depth. Your brand is important. As a profession, my account can be a bit out there. I'm reasonably professional, but I can take risks. I can be informal. The Ifoa, you just wouldn't expect the same behaviour, and they're another end of the spectrum. The ARG is probably somewhere in the middle. Responsiveness is really, really important. There was one media request we had from the BBC where, we waited an hour and a half to go back, and they were like, no, you should have just sent us what you sent Sky yesterday. We needed something in 15 minutes or not at all. The public misinformation won't go away, but I think its impact has been relatively limited. A lot of people really value objective data analysis. The amount of really nice comments that we've had from people saying, we just love that you're kind of straight down the line, that you're giving the same report, the same facts, whether it's a good news week or a bad news week, and actuaries are respected. People want to hear more. It would be great to have more actuarial voices, on social media. On social media, only punch upwards. I still have regrets from perhaps March last year, where I hadn't really quite realized how visible I was. And I went back to somebody that had made some unpleasant comments to me, basically saying I was scaremongering needlessly and there was no pandemic and whatever. If, what's your thoughts on this now? I was polite enough, but the 20 guys that jumped in weren't. Not physically, obviously, but social media pylons are unpleasant, and I don't like the fact that I caused one. Though actually punching upwards, I'm far more comfortable with. Something very similar happened with Baroness Helena Morrissey yesterday, that was pushing, not yesterday, last month, pushing Chinese conspiracy theory, Communist Party, are to blame for everything, kind of misinformation, and I called it out, and she had to lock her account. I'm much less worried about that when punching upwards. I'm going to stop. I've gone on too long. I've not left enough time for questions, but I'd be delighted to take any. Okay, I can see a couple here in the Q&A box. Do you feel there are long-term lessons on how insurers should present numbers to customers? For example, investment returns and other risks. I think we're going in the right direction on that. So, simplicity is key. What does this mean for me? Making sure that the key message is there and not lost. It's important to show uncertainty and ranges, but we need to make sure that our key message comes across for me. Next question. Have learnings from the past year changed how the Ifoa should engage with the media and the public? So Ifoa branded and ARG branded individual personalities. I think they have and are changing, yes. So there's been a lot of energy and attention within the Ifoa about what worked with the response group. How did it get such traction? But also a recognition that it's a child of its time, right? The next crisis we deal with, climate change, is going to be it's a slow burner. I'm not sure we won't be able to we won't be able to galvanize that sense of we need to act today, because you can kick that can down the road for a week or two, and so there will be different, particularly the climate change emergency is going to be more of a marathon. This has hardly been a sprint going on for over a year, but that's maybe the fight of the decade, and will need to be handled differently. But yes, I think the Ifoa has been giving a lot of thought to its communication strategy. Maybe there will be more use of personality on different topics. A go-to spokesperson on different things. I think the Ifoa's been reminded of how highly respected it is, and and that it can and should take positions on things. And I've seen far more provocative communications from them on a number of topics. With the charts understandable to the general public. So I don't know if this is about the main public briefings. So I think the quality of those improved over time. Our charts, I think, have been understandable to the general public. We've had some questions about log scales and so on. There's some charts the bane of my life has been the ONS charts that I put up. I mean, it's great work by the ONS, but you know, that I've learned that you sometimes just have to say things over and over. You know, every week I post a chart showing deaths over the last 12 months, and every week somebody says, "How come there's big dips at Christmas and Easter?" You know, just copy paste. It's because of the bank holidays. It's recording. The bank holidays are closed. You know, the recording offices are closed on bank holidays. I've ended up just writing it in the chart, and actually, since I wrote it in the chart, I haven't had the question. I was getting that question. I got that question 10 times one week. You know, read the comments. You can see everybody else is asking the same thing. Are we doing any analysis to try and help the situation in India? I was delighted to see the Ifoa speak up about the situation in India, and send heartfelt sympathies to people out there. It's a difficult problem. The data quality is not there. The issue with India is that unfortunately the data isn't telling us the real picture. And you know, we're not just talking about some of the data issues we've had here in terms of lags and you know, weekly deaths coming out a little bit later, but we're talking about you know, or even cause of death classification. We're talking about deaths actually not getting recorded. You know, that there might be a catch up with at some point later. So it is harder. We don't have you know, boots on the ground local expertise. The ARG is well represented in South Africa. In you know, we've got a lot of knowledge about the States and Canada and the UK. But we don't actually have you know, real expertise within our team on India. If there are any Indian actuaries listening that would like to contribute, you know, please do get in touch, and you know, we'd love to work with you on a bulletin. But you know, we don't want to reach beyond our expertise and draw the wrong conclusions from arm's length data. Am I worried about the full opening up of UK society in terms of a further wave? Not in the short term. So I think the chances of a spring wave, as we were terming it, look increasingly slight. The modeling I did about a month ago showed a good chance of a spring wave of infections, but not leading to a wave of hospitalizations and deaths. The latest update to that shows it's very hard to get a real proper wave of infections in the kind of spring summer. So that's great news. That's before I'm not allowing for a potential explosion of the Indian variant. So we're waiting on an update from Public Health England on the latest Indian variant numbers. It will be really interesting to see if that has leapt. Those numbers were held back yesterday because of the election. But I think even then, I think the chances of a wave that has significant numbers of hospitalizations and deaths in the next few months are small. The winter, I'm not going to try to predict. It will depend fundamentally on our actions. I think there is a very real chance, even with autumn boosters, of clusters of, you know, the vaccines haven't been distributed evenly. So there's a real chance of clusters emerging and potentially something of a winter wave. But, you know, let's keep an eye on that over the coming months. Well, the right preventative actions are being taken. We're ordering vaccines and, you know, so let's not try and predict something so highly uncertain as what the situation will be in a few months' time. I think we're out of time. I hope you found that useful, interesting. I'd be happy to take further questions by email. I'll be joining the president for his closing session, which I'm sure will be wonderful. He's a powerful orator. That starts, I think, in 15 minutes, half an hour's time. So perhaps see some of you then. Thank you.